Well, hey there, gang. Got a special one here today, or rather a junior one. This is a special junior. It's a Les Paul Junior from 1955. It's the second year of manufacture for these. It's in extremely clean condition. The finish is in great shape. It's got just enough bumps and bruises to make it look legit. And wonder of wonders, the headstock is in one piece. I don't have to re-glue this one, guys. So what am I going to do with it? Well, for one thing, the pots need cleaning. There's some scratchy stuff going on when you turn them. But the main thing is frets. These are old and tired and quite low, and the owner thinks it's time. He's got a mid-60s Telecaster with slightly bigger fret wire on it, and he'd like to get closer to that. This guitar sets up pretty nicely, just about 4/64ths of an inch, 1.5 millimeters at the 12th fret. Old juniors like this can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, depending on how close they got with setting the neck and gluing it in at the factory. The dog ear pickup cover that mounts directly to the body like this can cause clearance issues sometimes if you want super low action, because you can't raise and lower it. And if the neck angle is off a bit, then you end up banging into the cover with the strings. Slightly taller fret wire in that case can help out too. Gives you an extra 64th of an inch or something, so you're not having to lower the bridge down so far to hit your mark, and it stays slightly higher above the cover. The other thing is, there's a slight twist in the neck. It's not a bad one, and in fact it's twisted in the right direction if there is such a thing. If it's going to twist, this is the way it should do it. It's high at the base corner of the nut, and it moves all the way down the fingerboard, and it's high, in this case, on the treble side at the end of the fingerboard. So it kind of went and did this. Now, that leaves a little bit more room for the strings to vibrate on the bass side. It's hard to get great action, but you know, if it was twisted in the opposite way, it could cause relief problems. Now, I don't think it'll cause too much of an issue for us here. We can dress out that twist in the height of the new frets. And the board on this one has a really nice patina that it looks like part of the history of the guitar, and I don't really want to get rid of it by planing it dead flat, you know, taking the radius block and sanding it all the way back to bare wood all the way across. You know, there aren't huge divots from fingernails, there's no major damage on this, and it just looks the part. So I tend to be pretty conservative about these things. Unless someone wants me to do that, I try to leave the fingerboard alone and take care of any misalignment in the fret height if I can. Plus, it's got these really interesting little X's carved into the fingerboard at various points. There's one on the 3rd, a couple on the 5th fret there, and 2 on the 6th. Like, you know there's got to be a story there, right? And that's where the tone lives. It's where the mojo resides. It's probably witchcraft. You can't get rid of those. It could be dangerous. Let's check out the fret height here. It's around 25 thousandths of an inch. It's about 0.65 millimeters. That's about as low as most people can deal with. There are some crazed individuals who like it lower than that, but most people want it higher. It's also, this is vintage narrow wire, so it's probably less than 80 thousandths of an inch in width. Yeah, it's around 75. We're going to go with StewMac 152 wire, which is about 92 thousandths wide, and it starts off at around 48 thousandths of an inch tall. By the time we've dressed it flat, it'll probably be closer to 40 thousandths, which I think will feel comfortable and a lot more familiar for this gentleman. Just checking the amount of relief in the neck here. Actually not very much. It's only about 3 thousandths at the 6th fret, which is better than I thought it would be. What's the correct number? There really isn't. There are people who like an absolutely straight neck. In that case, they might require a little bit higher action to make that work for them. There are other people who need more relief in the neck depending on how they strum. I like to see less than 10 thousandths. And, you know, as low as it'll go is fine, basically. Having a look at the headstock, I wasn't sure whether it had been maybe oversprayed at some point. It's very shiny and very smooth. You see the Les Paul stamp has kind of gone away there. Those are very delicate. They're easy to abrade off. So whatever you do, don't buff a Les Paul headstock. Opening it up, here's something you don't see every day. 1955 Les Paul still has black paint on the truss rod nut and in the cavity, and there's some buffing residue there as well. Now, as much as I would have loved to preserve that, I have to make sure that the truss rod isn't maxed out because if I'm doing the refret, there has to be a little bit of adjustability, so I need to back it off and tighten it up again. And as soon as the tool touched it, naturally the lacquer flaked right off. Boo-hoo. But still, that's pretty cool. Start off with a preliminary cleaning of the board here using naphtha. Finger grease and gunk can build up alongside each of the frets, and when we're removing them, they can act almost like, sort of like a glue. And also when I heat them up, the stuff sort of tends to boil out. It's really gross and disgusting. So just going to clean along each side. This is kind of extreme, maybe unnecessary, but the lacquer on the side of the fingerboard is still in really good shape. And when it comes time to pull these frets up, I guess there is the possibility that I could chip a piece off. So I'm just taking a scalpel and running along the side of each of the fret tangs just to cut it there, cut down on that possibility. I'm putting a very light score line on either side of the frets. This does two things. First, it's cutting through that last little bit of grunge that might be packed down there in the corner, but it also acts like a relief cut. You know, when you're removing frets, there are barbs on either side of the tang, and when the fret is being pounded in or pressed in, those have moved sideways, laterally into the wood a little bit. They don't just go down, but because the fret wire is usually slightly over-radiused, in order to straighten out and fit in the fret slot, they get squeezed outwards. The fret straightens a bit. So when it comes time to pry those up, they buckle and split the surface of the fingerboard because they're coming out in a place that they didn't go in. So it breaks a bit, or a lot. Sometimes you see boards that have been really brutalized. They got big splits and chunks missing everywhere. So what the score line does is it provides a natural stopping point for the split, so it doesn't get a chance to move too far out beyond the footprint of the fret. In this case where we're sizing up, it's maybe not so critical, but when you're retrofitting the exact same size of wire, it can be a big help. Don't have to be deep cuts, just a really light score. On fret wire this low, it can be difficult to get the jaws of my fret pulling pliers to engage with it, so I'm just levering up the end using a rather dull chisel, protecting the surface of the fingerboard with a piece of metal wrapped in tape so that I'm not leaving divots in there. Just getting the blade in along the side and very gently lifting it up. Then I'll use my old and decrepit looking soldering iron here to heat up the fret and start to pull it. And this is a device sold by Stuart McDonald which goes along either side of the tang. Ostensibly it's supposed to keep the fingerboard surface, held down so it doesn't split, but in my case I like the fact that I'm spreading out the pressure from the pliers and not leaving divots in the wood. These frets are coming up very nicely. In a couple of places when I was heating them up I could smell glue in there. It smells like seared steak. It's an animal-based protein glue, but they came out just fine. Now I'm going to very, very lightly sand off the top surface of the board just to get rid of any grunge from the edges of the frets. Here I'm measuring the fret tang, the depth, so I can transfer that to my saw. I don't want to cut the slots too deep because that decreases the stiffness of the neck. Here I'm using a fret bender to put a radius into the wire that's slightly tighter than the 12-inch radius on the fingerboard. This is always fun. Then I'll clean that up with some alcohol to get rid of any grease that might be on it from the manufacturing process. Then I can cut the frets to length. There's some debate as to which is the correct orientation for the nippers, vertical like this or horizontal. I like it this way, so I'm going to continue doing it. And I can save the frets in my little number block here so I don't lose track of which goes where. Now, even though this is an unbound board, I don't really like the idea of having to file or sand up against that nicely lacquered surface, so I'm going to take my fret tang nipper and remove a little bit from the ends of each fret, about a 1/16 of an inch. There's always a little tiny nub that's left over on the bottom surface there, which I get rid of with a file, because otherwise sometimes you can see it in the final product. I'm going to clean out the fret slots, make sure of the appropriate depth. Actually on this board they were cut deeper than they needed to be, so this was pretty easy procedure. On my fret saw, I've filed the first couple of teeth narrower than the teeth on the main body, where they cut a 23 thousandths kerf, which is pretty standard for fret wire. First couple of teeth around 17, 18 thousandths. That acts as a guide. It brings the saw into the slot, cleans out any grunge, and makes sawing easier. We'll vacuum up all of the detritus. Here's an important step. Before I put the frets in, I take a triangular file and I just ease the top corner. This makes the frets go in easier and also makes them come out easier if they ever have to be removed in the future. I'm using fish glue to fill the fret slots and hold the frets down in place. It makes a nice rock solid installation. I lost the part where I was using my fret jaws to press in the frets in the lower positions. It starts out the same way. I tap in the corners. I either use the fret pressing jaws or the old-fashioned hammer method up here above the extension of the fingerboard. Have to check each fret as you go along to make sure it's properly seated all the way across the board. I can remove the little fret ends, making sure to catch those and save them because you don't want them floating around on your bench. Those will ruin everything. It's time to file a bevel. Now there is no fret tang here, so I'm not having to run the file against the side of the fretboard. I'm sighting down between the board and that white sheet of paper, and I'm angling the file so I know when to stop. I'm not sure if that makes sense. If this makes you scared, you can make yourself one of these little devices here that holds the file at an angle and runs against the top surface of the frets. When the glue is cured and shrunk back, there is a little gap at the end of the slots which needs to be filled with something. You could use shellac burn-in stick. In this case I'm using some tinted super glue.
Sounds great, huh? Wow, what an improvement. No, we knew this would happen. Increasing the fret height by almost double makes the nut slots too low, so I'm going to have to shim this. In a different guitar I might make a new nut. In the interim though, I have to string the guitar up so that it will behave like it will under string tension before I put it in the neck jig. And it's been sitting for a couple of days too. This is important because I used a water-based glue to seat those frets. The rosewood absorbs some of the water and it swells a little bit. It's not much, but if we were to go ahead and level the frets while it's swollen, things will change when it dries back out, right? So it's good to let it sit for a while. This wouldn't be a problem if we used a non-water-based glue. There are people who use epoxy. Super glue works fine too if you've got the nerve for it. For me, the cleanup of those things involves a lot more toxic, smelly stuff, acetone, methyl hydrate. And also, I like to make things easier for the next repair person down the line. So I stick with the fish glue. It works well for me.
So I put the thing in my neck jig, and here I am fiddling around trying to zero that dial indicator out so I know that it's in the same shape it was when it had strings on it. I need to remove the nut, so I'm carefully scribing around it so the lacquer doesn't break. Give it a tap and it comes free. Marking up the top of the frets so I know where material is being removed when it comes time to sand them. If I was a cool kid, I'd be using blue machinist die chem rather than Sharpie. And one of these days I should get myself a fancy leveling beam, but the old Stanley still works fine. It's maximum fat, you know, and I can relate to that. Do some recrowning. I'm using a 3-corner file this time because it's fun, and there's not too much to take off. I'm just rounding over the top surface of the frets. Working up over the body, you've got to protect the paint, so my wife brought home these big square plastic sheets, and I saw them and I said, I want one of those, and she very kindly gave them to me. Sanding and polishing. I can tell you that Gibson did not go to these lengths at the factory. They just grabbed a block with sandpaper on it and sort of swept it across the whole fingerboard in one go. Same thing with the fret ends. I'm rounding them over, giving this nice radius look to them, which is very kind to the fingers and provides a lot of playing area. So when we're through, the fret's dressed out to just over 40 thousandths of an inch tall. That's nice. Apply some fingerboard oil and make things shiny again. There was a great big divot on the back of the neck in a place where my thumb likes to go, and I could not let that live. I had to get rid of it, so I'd been applying numerous thin coats of super glue over a period of days. Here I am leveling it out using a razor blade. That's wood stain on the back of my finger, not peanut butter.
And once I've got that flush with the surrounding surface, I'll sand it with 1000 and 1200 grit papers and buff it up using polishing compound. The whole neck has a bunch of little tiny divots, but this one was a big monster. I couldn't keep it. It had to go away. Turning my attention to the nut, I'm going to shim it up. So I'm super gluing it to a piece of veneer. This is kind of debatable. I mean, in this instance, would I be better served making a new bone nut that's full height? Maybe. This is the original nylon one that Gibson put on there in 1955. It's survived 65 years. It's original to the guitar. There's nothing really wrong with it. It just needs to be 18 thousandths of an inch taller. So I think this is a reasonable solution. To disguise this nefarious deed, I'll apply a little bit of magic marker. The color? Cocoa bean. Just going to recontour the top surface a little bit because the nut slots were quite deep. That's one thing you can do to improve the tuning holding ability of a Gibson, is remove the excess nut material around the string. It only needs to be about half the diameter of the string in the nut. Anything more than that can cause drag and, well, tuning issues. Let's have a look at the bridge stud housing here. The owner wants me to check out a crack which had previously developed between the stud and the front of the pickup pocket. I can see that it's glued and it's tight. You can also see that there is actually a secondary ground wire which has been run from the base of the pickup over to the ring there. Apparently this has cut down on the hum, and being a superstitious fellow, I'm not going to remove it. Let's open up the control cavity and see what wonders lie in store. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Ooh, that's a vintage Grey Tiger cap. Looks a little bubbly, but it's still functioning well. The tone works good. You see there's a treble bleed circuit on the volume there as well. All looks fine. With the electronics cleaner in there, we just twirl the knobs a bit and the scratchiness goes away. Boy, you can see they gave you no extra wire when it comes time to tighten up your jack. And be careful not to break those contacts. So we'll get that screwed back down again. And here's a demonstration of the old wire versus the new. You see it's quite a bit bigger, but not too big. Doesn't look out of place. Setup continues in the usual way. Just checking out the nut height there. Needs a little bit of intonation adjustment on the treble side. Got to bring the bridge back about 1 millimeter. If you try this yourself, you make sure you detune all of the strings. All of the tension off, because that's a steel screw in a much softer metal, and if you don't, you'll strip it out faster than you can say, oh my, what have I done?
Alright, I think it's time to call it a day. The frets are all in. The historic augmentation is still in place there. The nut still looks like an old Gibson nut. The relief in the neck is exactly what it was when it came in. Very straight neck. The action turned out to be 1/16 of an inch, about 1.5 millimeters. That's pretty good for these. Can't go much lower than that because the strings would get too close to the pickup screws. And the intonation is okay. These wraparound bridges actually intonate not too badly. They're designed for wound G strings. But all in all, it sounds pretty good. I mean, what are you going to do? Play refined jazz on this? No, it's a rock and roll guitar, baby. Billy Joe Armstrong, Johnny Thunders. And what's not to like about a Junior? I mean, they don't give you anything you don't need. You got the one pickup, no bells and whistles to hide behind. The pickup is big and bold and microphonic. It's a little bit buzzy, but that's what you get with an old P90. I mean, they're very big coils. They pick up a lot of hum. If you don't like it, you go buy a reissue and put a Lindy Fralin noiseless P90 in it. But yeah, it's a really nice little guitar.